Well, if you start from right in the back, you've got a fire bar, you've got an emergency bar here, so that if you do, you know, take the rag or something, or you end up in the net, you hit that, and that pretty much isolates all of your electrics and your fuel. You've got roll, pitch, and yaw auto stabs. The aircraft had auto stabilization, and if you lost one of the channels, you would have to try and reset it. Otherwise, you weren't getting stabilization either in yaw or pitch. So you'd just make sure that you used to. There's your stab cutout there. So that would, if you ever got what was known as a UFCM, an undemanded flying control movement, that was normally driven by the auto stabs, and there was a problem with the auto stab system. So the first thing you do is cut out the stabs. There was no major, you know, it wasn't going to depart or anything, but you cut the stabs out, you keep flying, and then slowly you'd reselect the stabilizers, the auto stab system, one at a time to see if there was a problem. 9 times out of 10 it wasn't. It was just a bit of a fluke. But then you'd re-engage the stabs and you'd either carry on. But if it was a UFCM, you would then have to come back and say you would then write a report of when and how it happened, and they'd then go and have to stick it on a rig and try and reproduce it. And if they couldn't, then it would be on restricted flying for X number of sorties until it could be released again. You had a hand controller down here as well. This is one of the old-fashioned ones. This one here, used for things like bomb aiming, so you'd be able to manually ACL the bomb fall line. This radio essentially was moved, so this wouldn't have been there. There was another panel here, but this would have been moved over to here, so you had 2 radios. You also got your throttles. Bizarrely, you've got lights. So one of the worst things about the Jag was the lighting suite, which was just dire. So they seemed to design it and then go, oh my god, we've forgotten to put lights for night flying. So they then seem to use up any spare space with rotary switches, because you've got lights here and you've also got lights here, and it's it's a bit of a ergonomic slum. So you've got flaps, you've got overrides, pitch override as well. If there was a dual rate really for the pitch control was very strong, and because it wasn't fly by wire, what could happen was it had an enormous amount of movement. So the faster you got, it used to increase the pressure on the stick, so that you would know that you were putting more force in. Whereas actually with hydraulic controls, it didn't matter. You could pull it all the way back if it wasn't for that system. So if you had a pitch runaway, you'd isolate it, and then you could use the pitch trim through there. But actually, if you had a pitch trim runaway and you didn't isolate it, you were in serious trouble. Isolation. You got your flaps there. They were 8 stages. So bizarrely, you had half flap is 4, full flap come all the way down to 8, and then when you did a roller, you didn't try and reselect 4 again. You went all the way up to the top, and then you selected 4 again. It was just an easier way to do it, rather than clicking up. You could use the first 2 notches for combat flap if you wanted. The only time I really ever used those was in Oman, when we were fighting at low level, and you wanted every little bit of lift you could get, certainly in scissors. But once you started a rate fight and you were fighting around the 400, 420, then obviously those are well in, because you've got a limit of 260 knots. This that wasn't there in mine, but again, you can just see that you've got a lot of switches all over the place. You've got a hook, so if you're about to take off, you've got a hook there. You've also got a chute, and it was standard procedure, so it was hook first, then the chute. the last thing you want to do is pull the chute for it to fail, and in that time when you've pulled the chute you've missed the rag. So it was always hook, chute, and then you were going to make a decision as to whether you were going to jump out or not. Emergency blowdown of the gear, then you've got the gear itself. You had a stall warning which you could set at 14 or 17. We had various alpha limits. You had 14, 17 and 12 depending on what stall's configuration you have and what sort of fuel you were carrying. You just got nose wheel, whether your nose wheel steering was engaged or not, your hook and your air brake. You had a multi-position air brake. It wasn't like a Hawk which was out and in. You could, even when you're in formation, you could tweak the air brake out and in, so that if you're finding that you were overpowered, you could just crack the air brakes a little, and it would mean that you could have a higher power setting, which is easier to control because the engine's that much more responsive. So if you were at slow speed in formation, maybe you were configuring for whatever reason, as a number 2, if you're sort of right back on your haunches, and it's never nice being in formation when you're kind of low on the powers, on the RPM, what you can do is you can just crack the air brakes just a little bit. It gives you that little bit of drag, and then you can power up a little bit and play the power against the drag. It just makes life a little bit more comfortable. On the main panel here on the left hand side, you just got your normal flight instruments really. Trim indicator seems fairly innocuous, but actually you needed trim at a certain level for takeoff. I can't remember, I think it was 2 up for T-Bird and 0 on the GR. They introduced a differential tailplane, so it would actually look like it was twisting, and the diff TP would just give you an indication that the diff TP was on, and you could select it on if you wanted. So yeah, if you had a diff TP fail, you could select your differential tailplane to maximum when you were coming back into land, because that's when you need it. You don't really need it out flying doing general stuff, but when you're coming back in, you do need that extra turn authority and roll authority. So you got most of your standby instruments here. Fortunately, I was lucky enough to fly the 3 and the 3A and the equivalent in Oman, where the vast majority of the information was in the head-up display. So this was very much a standby system. Ajax, well, it was just one of those, again, another standby system. And up here we also had our laser, so you could set laser codes, and you could select which code you wanted in terms of your laser ranger, and so on. Used to have an INDU up here, big up front controller, nice big green HUD. Nav control. This has changed. This is the old version, and I think this was changed and eventually put up here because I think there were certainly some accidents attributed to guys leaning forwards, trying to change their navigation, trying to select which waypoint they wanted and all the rest of it, and actually flying into the ground. So they moved that and they put it up there, and that made life a lot easier. And then down here you've just got things like well, obviously you've got more navigation lights and more lights because we don't have enough light switches around, but then you've got things like your fuel, your LP, your fuel pumps, your starter, your air starter, and you essentially had a little gas turbine in a well, and you'd fire up the gas turbine, and then you'd select which engine to divert the high pressure air from that, which would start the engines. And you got your pumps and your HP cocks, and obviously life wouldn't be complete without a little lever that twirls around to move your foot pegs backwards and forwards. And on this side, obviously you got your fuel panel, fuel flows. We used to set, in essence, you could set your speed by your fuel flow. So early part of a sortie at low level, you're normally looking at 30 kilos a side. per minute burn rate, and that would be around your 450. And then once you've done about sort of 40 minutes or so, you could drop it down to 50 kgs, so 25 a side. And obviously when you go into full blower, that thing goes off the scale and you're probably chucking 250 odd kilos a minute out of the back end. So good indication, certainly at low level, of how you're doing in terms of speed. Engine RPMs, TGTs, nozzle, again very important for every time you select and deselect the burner. You've got to make sure that the nozzles are responding correctly, and even a fluctuating nozzle is probably fairly serious news, and so the nozzles and the fuel flow were two of the things that you had to check when you deselected burner. So it was, thing comes out of burner, nozzle, fuel flow, and those were mandatory checks every time. Central warning panel, you've got your hydraulics up there, and you've got an EHP, electro-hydraulic pump, so if you lost a hide system, you had an additional hide pump which would kick in. You had a power transfer unit as well, so one engine would run the other system, hydraulic system, but at a slightly depleted rate. Cabin pressure, your oxy, your volts, weapon control panel. This is pretty standard. This wasn't here. This was not an option that we had, but this was, and these were selective jettison. So if for whatever reason you wanted to get rid of your stores, certainly if wing tanks, say, selective jettison, you would raise the flaps and you'd blow them off, and that would, and I've done that once coming over the Atlantic. Had the jettison tanks after refueling FAF.
Trouble? Did you get in trouble?
No, I was told to get rid of them. So yeah, it was fine. So obviously selecting pylons, so you'd select your pylons, and then you could select your pylon, but then it had to have the right settings in terms of, you know, whether there was actually a store on there, and in the nose bay there was an AMU which you would set what sort of store you had, and whether it was a retard bomb or whether it was a slick or all the rest of it. So depending on what you had set, what type of fusing, and sort of that's your stick spacing. So if you wanted to drop 2 centerline stores, so you had 2 retards on there, you would have, and depending on what weapon effect you wanted on the ground, you'd select your stick spacing. You're normally in automatic, because that means that the computer's doing the release for you, so you're just hitting the commit button and the computer will work out when it wants to stop, when it wants to drop the bombs. And then obviously you've got both guns, only one on the T-Bird, but you got your guns on, so you can select your guns. Just a bog standard radio. You've got your demist, and you've got a seal that runs around here, so when you pressurize, you close the cockpit, you inflate the seal, pressurize the cockpit, air conditioning control, and then right at the back here normally is where you put your sandwiches, and those are all the circuit breakers, and that is about it. And that is the air conditioning pump, and they placed it on the wrong side of the bulkhead, so it's normally incredibly noisy. And that's it. That's the Jag cockpit, the ergonomic slum that it is. Part throttle reheat obviously is for tanking, where you've got the probe out on the right hand side, and cracking design, it's right in front of the engine, so you're disturbing the air not only from the basket but also from the probe. So and normally all tanking, you know, you don't really tank at low level. A, it's bumpier, and B, you know, it's just, there are limits and rules and regulations on where you can and can't tank. So we would generally tank around the sort of 16,000 mark ish, a bit lower if we could. And up at that height, if you had full tanks and you had centerline stores and you had outboard stores as well, be it ECM and FEMAT, you were a bit of a slug, you know, a bit of a lead sled. So used to select part throttle reheat on your number one, and that would engage reheat down to sort of 2 nozzle, which is kind of minimum, from about 80% RPM. So you would have more thrust available to you without having to go from full dry into min burner, which would come up to 4 nozzle, which was sometimes a bit too much, especially if you were a bit lighter. So you'd have the part throttle reheat on the number one, so that, you know, you just had a bit more oomph. But as it was, you know, if you were high, it was hot, you had a full, you know, recce pod, 2 tanks, ECM FEMAP, you would quite often be full blower on the number, so you'd be full blower on the number one, and then you'd probably be in min burner on number 2 as well, potentially. So yeah, she was, everybody jokes about the power, but yeah, she was massively underpowered, especially for tanking when she was in full war load. So but yeah, when you were, one of the benefits of part throttle reheat, certainly as an instructor, was you would sit in the back when you were teaching the students their sort of formation takeoffs, because they're normally used to something like the Hawk, where you just go full dry and then you crank it back a bit on the TGT, and then you'd sit there. With this, you could modulate the blower. So you normally from the back you'd have both of the throttles on part throttle reheat, so that if the student did accidentally, during their nightmare of a formation takeoff, if they did accidentally pop out, and if you sort of, you can hear them as you pop through the gate, what happens then is the nozzles then shut down, so your nozzles close right off, you're then in full dry, and you've pretty much dropped 6,000 pounds of thrust. So the normal student response is to immediately go back into full burner, and that creates potential problems with surging the engines. So as the instructor in the back, you'd have both on PTR, so that if they do come out of reheat through the gate, they haven't actually come out of reheat. So you've negated that potential problem of the students then going out of reheat into reheat and potentially surging the engines. As it was, you know, I've done it a couple of times and it never really complained.